The backpack was still swinging when they found it pink, glittery, half-zipped, a juice box poking out like a tongue. No footprints in the mulch, no scream carried on the wind. Just a fading sunset over Willow Creek Park in Ashfield and a backpack that should have been slung over the shoulder of 9-year-old Sophie Hart. She was smart and shy. Brown hair braided by her mother that morning, always home by 4:15, except today. At 4:32, her mother called the school. At 4:39, she was already circling the neighborhood. By 5 o'clock, the sheriff's deputies had strung yellow tape between the swings and the slide, forming a search grid on DMP grass. People showed up, neighbors, teachers, teenagers with flashlights, shouting Sophie's name into bushes and peering under porches as the sky purpled. By dusk, the calls grew less frequent, swallowed by cold and the low hum of generators. Powering floodlights. Officer Mark Bennett arrived 14 hours into his shift when most volunteers were heading home. Beside him in the cruiser sat Scout, his German shepherd, eyes bright, tongue curled. Scout wasn't the youngest or fastest K9 anymore. His muzzle had gone gray at the corners, and arthritis stiffened his right paw on cold mornings. But Scout had something Mark could never quantify, a feeling for edges. When a door hid more than a broom, when a closet wasn't just full of coats, when a bush contained more than leaves, Scout paused. He sensed things. It had saved lives before. Mark looked at him through the open cage divider. "Another missing kid," he murmured. "Another clock." Scout flicked an ear, watching Mark the way he did when waiting for his chance to work. They didn't yet know that this case would test the limits of patience, that Scout's refusal to give up would uncover something far darker than a lost child and would lead them on a path that not everyone wanted to see. If stories like these move you, take a breath and stay with us. By sharing and subscribing, you become part of a community that believes in second chances and four-legged heroes who change lives when hope is hanging by a thread. They reached Willow Creek just after sunset. Floodlights cast long shadows, and a search supervisor handed Mark a laminated map dotted with circles. "She was on the swings alone after school," he said, pointing to an area near a slide. "Backpack found. Here, witness says she was there then." Nothing. Mark clipped Scout's leash, feeling the dog's body hum with anticipation, and said, "Find." Scout lowered his nose and wove through damp grass. He sniffed benches, trash bins, tree trunks. He circled, pausing at a chain-link fence that separated the park from the creek. Wind rippled off the water. Mark watched Scout's tail sink, his ears stiffen. The dog sat and stared at the mouth of a concrete storm drain, covered in moss and rust. He let out a whine that was more mournful than alert. Most dogs bark when they find. Scout mourned. Mark approached and shined his flashlight into the drain. It was black inside, moisture on concrete, a faint smell of wet leaves. The search supervisor behind him shook his head. "We checked. Runs maybe 15 feet. Nothing." Mark should have moved on, but something in Scout's posture, rigid and pleading, not excited, made him linger. "He's never wrong," Mark said. "He's picking up an old scent," the supervisor countered. Rain started to fall. They were called to another quadrant. Mark tugged the leash gently. Scout followed, but each time Mark turned his head, the dog's eyes were back on the pipe. By midnight, most teams had packed up, defeated. News vans rolled away, promising to return in the morning for sad interviews and B-roll of flashlights. Over fields, it rained harder. Mark stood under a tree, his uniform soaked through. Scout sat by the storm drain, tail curled around his paws, nose almost touching the rust. He would glance up at Mark, then back at the darkness, as if asking for belief. At dawn, Mark drove home and stared at the map on his kitchen wall. Scout lay at his feet but looked toward the door every few minutes. Mark knew that look. "We're not done." He put on a dry jacket. "Let's go back." In the early light, Willow Creek was empty. Dew glistened on swings. Mark parked by the gate, and before the engine cut off, Scout jumped out and trotted straight. To the storm drain, Mark followed. The dog's body language was the same, rigid but imploring. "All right," Mark sighed, kneeling. "One more time." He shined his flashlight. Moisture shimmered on concrete. He exhaled and turned the light off to see if his eyes would adjust. It was worse. Darkness pressed in. He waited. Then he heard a sound. Faint, like fabric scraping stone. He blinked, turned the light back on. Nothing. He turned it off again, heart thumping. Then a tiny hand appeared from around a bend, trembling and pale, fingers reaching blindly. Mark's breath caught. "Sophie?" He whispered, forcing calm into his voice. He radioed for backup, then crawled partway into the drain, water soaking his pants. "Stay with me," he murmured, guiding her by the sound of his voice. He reached, grabbed her fingers, then her wrist, and pulled. When they dragged her into daylight, she was soaked, shivering, eyes half closed. MTs wrapped her in foil. Blankets. Her lips were blue, her nails dirty. She whispered as they lifted her onto a stretcher. "I heard the dog." He stayed. Mark leaned closer. "The dog?" Her teeth chattered. "I thought everyone left. I heard him. I stayed awake. Because he was there." Scout sat by her side, licking her wrist between the medic's hands. His tail moved once. Later they learned Sophie had been followed after school by a man in a hooded sweatshirt. She had run, squeezed through brush, and crawled into the storm drain to hide. In the dark she panicked, crawled deeper, got lost. Eek! Rained, and she curled against the cold concrete, afraid to move. She had thought no one was coming until she heard Scout whine at the pipe and realized someone still searched. The news showed the rescue, the stretcher, the crying parents, but not the part where Scout stood vigil in rain when everyone else had gone home. Not the whimper that convinced a girl she was seen. Mark and Scout went home to collapse, but a folder waited on Mark's desk the next morning. "Sophie Hart internal note," it said. Inside were typed reports with commentary from a behavioral analyst highlighting possible fabrication and trauma-induced confusion. Lack of footprints leading to the drain, the absence of surveillance footage, and the fact that Sophie had not screamed all fed doubt. In the locker room, Mark overheard whispers. "She must have wandered in there herself. Why didn't she yell sooner? Maybe she imagined the man in the hoodie." Mark stared at the report until the words blurred. He looked down at Scout curled beside. His boots, eyes flicking between Mark and the door. "She didn't make it up," he said quietly. Scout blinked slowly, as if in agreement. He took the report and slid it under a stack of bills at home. Then he returned to Willow Creek. No cameras, no volunteers, just morning fog and damp leaves. He let Scout off leash. The dog trotted past the drain and into the overgrown brush beyond, toward a wooded area behind an old maintenance road. He paused where grass was flattened under a tree trunk. Mark knelt and found a crushed juice box identical to the one in Sophie's backpack. His stomach tightened. They searched further and found a partial footprint large, not from a child, and a piece of fabric snagged on barbed wire. It was something, but not enough to reopen a case everyone wanted closed. That evening Mark drove to a small house on the edge of town. Grace Sullivan answered in fuzzy socks, hair in a messy bun. She'd been a crime analyst in Portland before burnout pushed her to take a job at a quieter county sheriff's office. Mark spread the photos on her kitchen table. Grace traced her finger over the map. "She was chased," she said after a minute. "You can see the path. She didn't just run and hide." "She was being hunted," Mark nodded. "But no one believes it." Grace sipped her coffee. "They don't want to. If there's a predator at a suburban park, the mayor has to admit he can't keep kids safe." Mark looked away. "So we do nothing?" Grace slid the juice box back. We keep looking off the books. Every night that week, Mark and Scout went back. Each time the dog found something small scuffed dirt by a utility shed, a rusted flashlight under branches, a section of fence bent open and tied back with zip ties. Mark documented it all, quietly building a file in his desk drawer. He knew that going up the chain would get him a pat on the head and an order to stand down. He also knew he wouldn't be able to sleep if he did. On Friday, rain threatened again. Mark slid into a poncho and followed Scout to the edge of the park. The dog sat before a pile of rocks and whimpered, his alert to something hidden rather than someone present. Mark moved the rocks. Beneath them was a torn black hoodie, too small for an adult, too large for a child. Inside the pocket lay a burner phone with a dead battery. At home, Mark charged it and powered it on. No contacts, no texts. But in the gallery was a single photo, a blurry image of the Willow Creek Park sign timestamped 2 hours before Sophie disappeared. Someone had scoped the place. Mark's jaw clenched. He called Grace. "You were right." She came over and sat cross-legged on his living room rug, scanning through the metadata. The phone's cloud backup was tied to 3 other devices linked to loitering incidents outside schools, daycare centers and public pools up and down the coast. "Whoever this is, he travels," she said. "He watches." They pinned the photo on the wall, connecting it with red string to scribble dates and maps of other missing child reports that had been quickly closed. 6 cases. 6 girls missing briefly, found shaken but alive. 6 towns visited by a black SUV captured on grainy gas station cameras. The pattern was there. Mark added it to his own corkboard next to Scout's bed. The dog lay beneath, tail gently beating the floor, eyes alert. "Ready to find him?" Mark asked. Scout stood, answer clear. Grace raised an eyebrow. "You're going rogue," Mark shrugged. "The system decided not to see. We don't have that luxury." Their search took them 2 hours east to Brookvale, a sleepy town with orchards and a single gas station. There, the clerk recognized the SUV from the photo. Slick black tinted windows didn't come in. "Just sat in the lot," he said, shaking his head. "No front plate." Mark and Scout canvassed the area. Scout sniffed the parking lot, then moved toward a drainage ditch behind a row of trees. Beyond a bent wire fence lay an overgrown clearing with an old barn. The roof sagged, walls leaned. Rusted tools hung from nails. Scout paused at the threshold, nose high. He barked once, short and sharp. Mark drew his gun and stepped inside. The barn smelled of mold and gasoline. Tarps covered bins in the corner. Under one tarp, fast food. Wrappers. Under the next, zip ties and duct tape. The third hid children's clothes, a pink shoe, a faded backpack with stickers. Mark's mouth went dry. Scout growled at the back wall. Behind a rotting hay bale was a trap door. Mark lifted it. A tunnel, 15 feet long, reinforced with plywood, led into darkness. Scout wouldn't go in. He sat and whined. That was enough. Mark took photos, careful not to disturb anything, then backed out and called Grace. "He's not just passing through," he whispered. "He's building hideouts," Grace's reply crackled. "Predators sometimes have stash houses. This is bigger than we thought." Mark wanted to stake it out and wait for the man. His adrenaline surged. Scout stood at his side, ready. But his gut told him to lock the place down. He anonymously flagged the location to a state task force, hoping they would quietly collect evidence before the press descended. They were filling up at a gas station on the way back when Scout growled low. Across the street sat the black SUV. Engine running, windows dark. Mark's pulse quickened. He had no warrant, no jurisdiction in Brookvale. The law would tell him to call local authorities and wait. But Scout's stare didn't waver. Mark trusted the dog more than procedure. He drove around the block and parked where he could watch. Minutes dragged. Finally, a man in a hoodie got out and walked to the back. pulling a trash bag that sagged like it contained something heavy. He carried it behind a row of mailboxes. Mark got out and followed, staying in shadows. He raised his phone and snapped photos. Then he stepped into the open. Sheriff's Department. "Don't move," the man bolted. Mark released the leash. "Scout, take!" The dog sprang, paws pounding. He caught the man's calf and dragged him down. Mark cuffed him. Inside the trash bag were dozens of photos, playgrounds, schoolyards, children, some taken weeks earlier, some unknown. It was enough for suspicion of stalking and child endangerment. The man refused to speak without a lawyer. He had no identification. The local department called in federal agents. Mark sat outside, Scout pressed against his leg, while officials in suits boxed up evidence. "You did it," Grace said over the phone. "No," Mark replied, looking down at Scout. "He did." The next week was a blur. Mark visited Sophie at the hospital. She sat up in bed, cheeks flushed. Her parents hovered, exhaustion etched into their faces. When Scout entered, Sophie's eyes lit up. She reached out and touched his fur. "I knew." "He was magic," she whispered. Mark smiled. "He's just a dog." She shook her head. "He's the dog." He filed a report detailing the chase in the barn. It went into a file. He saw suspicion in some colleagues' eyes, respect in a few. He went back to Brookvale alone a few days later, walking the perimeter of the now secured barn. Scout sniffed the edges. He did something new. He pawed gently at the floorboards near the back wall. Mark pried one up, another crawl space. Inside, a blanket, empty juice boxes, a pair of ballet slippers coated in dust. There were other dugouts, some shallow, some reinforced. They brought in ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. Federal agents arrived quietly, speaking in hushed tones. They found 3 more dugouts like that, each with small comforts blankets. Juice boxes, toys like someone had kept children there for hours or days and then moved them on. It became clear Sophie's rescue had interrupted a predator mid-game. The press labeled the case a miracle and moved on. Officials sealed the file. But Mark couldn't sleep. Back at his house, Mark pored over the evidence with Grace. In one of the dugouts they found a small fabric book stuffed into a vent. It was a child's diary dated October 2016. Inside, a girl named Samantha wrote about being locked in a place. She described footsteps and voices, someone leaving food but never letting her out. On the last page she drew a dog with the words, "I heard him, but he didn't find me." Mark's blood went cold. Samantha had never been reported missing. They had stumbled onto a serial abduction case that predated any of the 6 incidents Mark had mapped. Grace whispered, "This is bigger than a guy in a hoodie." Mark nodded, fists clenched. "We missed her." He went home and sat on his porch, Scout beside him, a weight settling on his chest. How many hadn't they saved? Scout whined and pressed his head against Mark's knee as if sensing his despair. The name House with Yellow Stairs appeared repeatedly in Samantha's diary. It was a clue, but vague. For days Mark drove down rural back roads with Scout, riding shotgun. They passed farms, motels, tool sheds. Nothing. Then, stopping at a gas station for coffee, Mark returned to find Scout standing on the truck hood, staring down the road. The dog leapt off and trotted toward a property with peeling paint and wooden steps painted a cheerful yellow. Mark's stomach dropped. He called it in as a welfare check and knocked. No answer. The windows were intact but dark. A young deputy arrived, shifting nervously. Mark flashed his badge out of habit. "I'll take lead." Around back he found a shed with a padlock on the outside. When he pried it open, he gagged on a smell of old sweat and mildew. Inside was a cot, a bucket, and a lock, a cage disguised as a garden shed. A warrant issued within an hour allowed them to search the house. Files were everywhere, photos, handwritten notes, lists of parks' dates. Only one room looked lived in. The rest was storage. They identified 3 other victims from the notes, all rescued and relocated, their cases chalked up to runaway teens. It was one story now, one man, one network, one dog that refused to let a storm drain remain just a drain. Federal agents took over, promising to dig deeper. Mark knew they would, but he also knew bureaucracy moves slower than predators. A few weeks later, Mark drove Scout to an elementary school to talk to a class about bravery. He didn't speak about dark tunnels or serial kidnappers. He told them about Scout waiting in the rain, about following a trail when no one else believed. There was one. A boy raised his hand. Did he ever save you? Mark smiled. More times than I can count. Afterward, kids petted Scout, some shy, some giddy. A little girl whispered secrets into the dog's ear. Another slipped Mark a dog biscuit and said, "He earned it." Scout accepted it gently. Those moments of light made the nights easier, but nights remained restless. Scout paced the hall. He whimpered at the basement door. He sat at windows longer than necessary. When the federal agents declared the case closed, Mark knew it wasn't. Grace called from a foster home in another town. A girl had seen a man watching her school. Same description, same SUV with one new detail, a limp. Mark thought of a small dugout he hadn't explored fully near Brookvale. He remembered footprints, one deeper than the other. He nodded slowly. He's not done. They drove to the town without telling anyone. They patrolled the perimeter. On the second pass, Scout lowered his head by a row of trash bins and growled. Under soggy cardboard lay a white baseball cap with a smudged letter S on the brim. It might have meant nothing to someone else. Mark bagged it and waited. They slept in the truck behind an abandoned gas station. At 2 a.m., Scout sat up. Out the windshield rolled the black SUV, headlights off. Mark's heart pounded. He followed. At a distance, the vehicle pulled into a trailer park and stopped. Minutes ticked. Scout growled deep. Mark crept forward. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. A crash glass breaking, then running feet. Mark and Scout bolted around back. A figure in a hoodie limped through the weeds. "Scout, take." The dog leapt, caught his leg, and brought him down. Mark cuffed him and found no ID in his wallet, only a photo of a little girl he didn't recognize. The feds processed him like it was any other arrest. They didn't ask Mark for details. They suspended him for unauthorized field work. He crumpled the letter of suspension and tossed it into a bin. He didn't need a badge to listen to Scout. Together, they followed the clue on the photo to a town 3 hours away and found Emily, the girl in the picture, in a locked basement, alive but barely. It made the suspension worth it. Time moved. Scout grew slower. Arthritis crept up his legs. He slept deeper, but always woke when Mark put on boots. Word spread quietly about what he'd done. The governor's office wanted to name a new program after him. Mark almost declined, but Grace insisted it wasn't about ego. It was about funding training for dogs like Scout in departments that couldn't afford them. They launched Scout Response, a fund that rescued shelter dogs and trained them for search and support roles. In its first year, it placed 7 dogs, 4 found missing children. 2 became emotional support dogs at schools. 1 was adopted by a little girl Scout had once saved. She named the dog Ranger. Mark went on rides with his trainees, never charging. He visited victims. He spoke quietly about paying attention when animals sense things. He took calls from detectives, teachers, and parents seeking advice. He still patrolled on his own, still drove down back roads with Scout, listening to the world. One early spring morning, Mark woke to find Scout lying in the yard, facing the rising sun, breathing slow. The dog's tail curled around his hind legs. Mark sat beside him. Scout's eyes opened, looked at him, then closed. He didn't gasp, didn't whine. He was just still. Mark buried him under the oak tree by the porch. Neighbors came, some of the kids now teenagers. Grace placed Scout's worn vest on a chair. Mark didn't give a speech. He only said, he never stopped looking, and he never stopped feeling. People left flowers, toys, notes. One child wrote in crayon, "Scout didn't talk, but I heard him." Mark built a bench under the tree. He still drove sometimes, still watched playgrounds, still followed the tug in his chest when a dog stiffens. His tail. He trained another shepherd, younger, goofy, eager. That dog stopped mid-fire drill and barked at a janitor's closet. Inside they found a 6-year-old girl hiding, too scared to yell. Mark smiled. The best of Scout lived on in instinct, in refusing to walk away. Thank you for walking this long road with Scout and Mark, from a storm drain, vigil to unraveling a web of darkness that spanned counties. Their story shows that heroes don't always wear capes or even badges. Some have 4 legs and communicate in whines and wagging tails. If Scout's journey touched you, consider sharing it with someone who believes in second chances and the bond between animals and people. And if you've ever had a moment where an animal sensed something no one else did, we'd love to hear about it. Stay with us for more stories of courage and quiet strength, the kind that remind us that hope can be found in the persistence of a dog who refuses to stop listening.